Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, March 21st, day 532 of the war. Amanda Borcel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter Berman for a briefer briefing ahead of a full episode of our new Friday Focus series. Thanks for joining me, Laser.
Good morning, Amanda. Good to be here.
In a stormy session late last night, the cabinet voted unanimously to fire Shin Bet head Ronen Bar. Already minutes after the vote, the Movement for Quality Government in Israel said it had filed a high court petition against the government's dismissal of Bar. It is assuredly just the first of many petitions over this controversial cabinet move. The move marked the first time in Israeli history that the government has fired the head of the Domestic Security Agency. Laser, take us through Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's motivations for Bar's dismissal, according to what was said at last night's meeting.
Well, first of all, what we have is what the Prime Minister's office put out from the meeting in the name of Netanyahu. And there you have Netanyahu actually saying something new about Ronen Bar. And he's had a whole series of reasons and allegations against Bar, but this time he calls him soft. He says he was not aggressive enough in these hostage negotiations. Netanyahu says he met with him multiple times. He spoke with him. He tried to explain the fact that Bar's approach was ostensibly too soft. And when he realized he couldn't do it, he removed him from the hostage negotiating team. And then Netanyahu says, since that happened, then we've seen all this movement on getting hostages out, even though that deal right now seems to have fallen apart. But there was that period of over a month and a half, where Israel was able to get dozens and dozens of hostages living and some dead out of Gaza. Of course, what doesn't really work here is that Israel was able to get to that deal before Bar and Mossad chief David Barnea were removed from the hostage team. So the timeline there doesn't work out entirely well. There was also a quote-unquote anonymous official whom Channel 12 says was straight from the Prime Minister's office itself that said something really more drastic, almost shockingly so. And he says, this anonymous source, again, that is said to be from the Prime Minister, says, why, after you knew about the Hamas attack many hours before it happened, did you do nothing and did you not call the Prime Minister? So this is an allegation that Bar knew the attack was going to happen hours before it happened and didn't act. It's really quite a staggering allegation.
What so far has been Bar's response?
Well, Bar's response hasn't been to those statements that came out of the meeting. It was to the summons to the meeting itself that Israel sent out. And ultimately, he refused to go to the meeting, and he sent this multi-page letter that the Shin Bet circulated, where he deals, first of all, he does three different things. One, he deals with the claims in the letter. He says that they're unfounded. He says that they're not legally done. They don't give examples, and therefore it's hard to respond to something that is just kind of general and hasty. And that the meeting itself to dismiss him violates Israel's laws against removal, especially of a senior figure like the head of the Shin Bet. He also questions the motivation there. And he says that it seems to be that these unfounded claims are, quote unquote, nothing more than a cover for completely different, extraneous, and fundamentally invalid motives. And why does he say this? To disrupt the ability of the Shin Bet to fulfill its role. He talks about the fact that Netanyahu seems to want to get in the way of Qatargate, which is this investigation into alleged Qatari influence on advisors in the Prime Minister's office. And Bar says that, that must go on. The Shin Bet must continue to investigate that. And Netanyahu has a personal and institutional conflict of interest here that means he's calling his judgment into question. He also says more serious things. He says that him and Netanyahu worked well together. He points at hostage release deals. He points at a bunch of operational successes in the north and in the south. And so he says there's no basis for this insistence that there's no trust between us, except if the real intention is to negotiate without reaching a deal. So he says that Netanyahu really doesn't want to reach a deal right now either. And then he says that Netanyahu's decision to remove Bar and Barnea harmed the hostage negotiating team and did not make the release any easier. The hostage releases that happened. So it's a very aggressive letter, and it's in his name. And obviously, once he wrote that, that's a recognition that he's not going to continue very long in his role.
What has polling found so far regarding the Israeli public sentiments surrounding Bar's dismissal? And of course, how much does the public trust Netanyahu?
There's all sorts of polling, but let's do channel 12. They had a poll last night that says 51% of Israelis oppose the firing and 32% that support it. So that's a pretty big gap right there in the sides. And they also had 46% saying they trust Ronen Bar more than Benjamin Netanyahu, and only 32% trust Netanyahu more. So this seems to be an issue that, at least according to those polls, is not going to be a political winner for Netanyahu. Again, that has to make you ask why he's doing it then, if the accusation is that he's doing it only for partisan political purposes. There's the theory, again, that it's Qatargate, but Netanyahu himself will say, the only reason I'm doing this is because we just can't work well together. And that's what Netanyahu loyalists in the government are saying. So certainly it's a political risk for Netanyahu.
All of this is, of course, coming as the IDF has renewed a ground offensive in the Gaza Strip. So obviously, it is in no one's interest to have the position of the head of the Shin Bet vacant or in question. So what are the next steps as far as we know?
Right. The role is not going to remain vacant. Bar is going to stay in office until April 10th, or perhaps earlier if the government can find a replacement. There are some names, there are some letters out there, because we can't say their full names until they become the head of the Shin Bet. There's Mem, there's Reish, and then there's people like a former Shin Bet official, Shalom Ben Hanan. There was also Meir Ben Shabbat, who used to be Netanyahu's national security advisor, being bandied about. So there are certainly plenty of qualified people. It's a question of making that decision. But Bar will continue in his role, and operationally, even after this came out, and even after Netanyahu told Bar he was going to try to dismiss him, they've obviously worked well together, and they've obviously been able to work on the start of this resumption of the fight in Gaza. So it's not like there's going to be no one at the helm.
Lazer, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Listeners, please stay tuned for our Friday focus. This week, Lazer explores the windy, twisty path taken to maybe, just maybe, the forging of an official border between Israel and Lebanon in the near-ish future. Until then, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, March 21st, day 532 of the war. Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with the brains of the operation, our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman. Hi, Lazer. Thanks for joining me from the Jerusalem office.
Good to be here. Not the looks, but the brains of the operation.
Maybe you have a bit of both, okay?
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
It's kind, it's also true. So, Lazer, today our focus is on Israel's border, or actually the lack of an official border with Lebanon. And we have a lot of different aspects to explore, among them the recently mediated maritime border and the idea of a buffer zone in light of the war that is ongoing in Gaza, and of course Hezbollah's joining of that war on October 8th, 2023. So we're going to unwind some of the issues regarding the border and give some historical background. And then at the end, Lazer will assess how he sees things moving forward into the future. So we'll talk about all this and more when we're back. Laser, last week you reported that Israel is aiming to establish full diplomatic relations with Lebanon in talks that could start as early as next month. So just to remind our listeners, on November 27th, 2024, a truce in Lebanon largely halted more than a year of hostilities that were initiated by Hezbollah on October 8th, 2023, including 2 months of really full-blown war during which Israel sent in ground troops. And of course, there were slews of assassination. Hezbollah was largely decimated. And here we are today. So there was a meeting last week in southern Lebanon between Israel, Lebanon, France, and the U.S. with an eye towards normalization between Israel and Lebanon. That's really amazing because until today, there is really no 100% official border, and Israel and Lebanon don't really even recognize each other, though there was, as you noted in a piece you wrote recently, a short-lived peace agreement in 1983. So let's wind things back a little bit and talk about, well, first of all, the lack of a border, an official border between Israel and Lebanon.
Yeah, so I think I might even go back, not in time, but somewhat conceptually, to talk about what on earth is a border when we talk about it. And an official international border is an agreement between two countries on where the line of one's sovereignty ends and the other one's begins. And it's a fairly modern concept, especially in the Middle East. So if we think about when did borders come to our little neck of the woods, when did they come to our neighborhood? It's pretty recent. Why? Because for 400 years, the ruler in the region was an empire, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And within an empire, there might be administrative jurisdictions, boundaries, but there's not an international border, of course. The first international border that really comes and touches our region is in 1906 between the Ottoman Empire and the British, where the British were controlling Egypt, and they set a line which persists as the basis for the border between Egypt and Israel to this day, in the negative. Now, in terms of where we're talking about in our current discussions, which is Israel's northern border where it becomes Lebanon, there was no such concept under the Ottomans of there being a distinction between the two. The Galilee continues, the mountains of the Galilee continues into Lebanon. And the distinction between the Ottoman administrative districts was way south. It was north of Jerusalem. So you had this district of Beirut, which was modern-day Beirut, and it continues south into the Galilee, northern Galilee, southern Galilee, into Samaria, and down toward Jerusalem. And then south of that, you had the district of Jerusalem. So how on earth did we even get to this idea where there are two entities that were coming up against each other? And for this, we go to the death of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, this old empire, as I said, goes back to the 16th century in this region. And it took part in World War I on the side of the Central Powers, on the side of Austro-Hungary, on the side of Germany. And from the early days of the war, from 1915, the powers that were the Western powers, not only Western, also Russia, Italy, were talking about what happens after the Ottoman Empire is defeated and how do we carve it up. And the two main players there, and this is something that we've talked about in the past, and I'm sure many of our readers are aware, are the French and the British. So it started in 1915. There were these secret conversations between a not very senior, not very successful to that point diplomat called Mark Sykes on the British side, and a diplomat whose last name was Picot. He has a whole series of names. I forget them all, but he had a very grandiose name. You should look it up. One of these gentlemen diplomats on the French side. And they started talking about where the line between these future areas of influence would be set. For the British, what was important was mainly the preservation of their control or their influence over Mesopotamia toward India. And for the French, they had these historic connections going back to the Crusades, if you want to see how far back the story of Israel's borders go, to the Christians in Syria, to the Christians in what is today Lebanon. And they certainly saw themselves as a defender of the Christians. That line that was agreed on in 1916 is south of today's border or boundary with Lebanon. It basically runs kind of from the north of Tiberias on the northwest corner of the Galilee and runs out toward Achziv, Nahariya. So it doesn't include a lot of the northern Galilee. Of course, this line was just an agreement between two parties. Really, Italy and Russia also took part, but not in our region. And of course, when in 1918 the war comes to an end, the situation is quite different. Why? You have British troops in what would become mandatory Palestine, and you have discussions that start or that are really centered on the Paris peace conferences. Sometimes they take place in London. 1919, 1920, that's when the countries are starting to really talk about what are the boundaries between the different areas of control. The Zionists show up at the 1919 conference, and they have their own proposition. Their proposition is much, much grander than even what Israel has today. It goes up to the Litani River, which is that very clear river valley in southern Lebanon. When we talk about the wars in southern Lebanon, we talk about the Litani River a lot. It encompasses the Golan Heights. It gets very close to Damascus, really just close to this Ottoman highway. It even includes the fertile land of Jordan and Transjordan, so over the Jordan River. So this was the Zionist desire, the Zionist map that they put forward. And actually the British, who had a couple of years before put forth the Balfour Declaration, were very interested at that time in supporting the Zionist claims. And they wanted to see that the Zionists got some sort of country which was sustainable economically. So they wanted to make sure that the Zionist farmers had significant water rights to the sources of the Jordan, which means well above the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, which means you went pretty far up into the Galilee, and they wanted to give Israel the sources of the sources of the Jordan coming off the Hermon mountain. But there's this other thing as well. The British diplomats were kind of these gentlemen who had gone to British private schools and had been well educated in Latin and Greek, but also on the Bible. And in their view, there was this biblical land of Palestine, which should be kept as one intact unit. And there is a description in the Bible of the land going up to the Dan, right, from Beersheba to the Dan. The Dan describes one of the tribal areas of the tribe of Dan, but it also describes the headwaters of the Jordan, and therefore they were interested in protecting the Zionist claim well north of the Sea of Galilee, and they even saw reasonable claims to the Litani River because that would be easily defensible for them.
Right. I want to ask you about this. Of course, Laser, in the past, year, we've been talking about the Litani River a lot. And in terms of the topography between the two countries, would it have made more security sense for the border to have been on the Litani River, which is this, myth, almost archetypical sticking point right now in terms of where Hezbollah shall not cross?
Yeah, well, in terms of boundaries are set in different ways. Sometimes they incorporate demographic groups, right? But in terms of Israel's case, it wasn't that they were drawing a border around a demographic group, as they did not very much in the Middle East, but let's say the Kurds are claiming that we should have a boundary because we live here. In Israel's case, it was different. It was let us draw a boundary, and then Jews from around the world will come home into that boundary, which is a safe place for them to come to. So geographically, it would have made sense. But of course, then you would be incorporating some Christian villages, which really would not have been a problem, but a lot of Shia villages as well. So demographically, it probably would have made less sense.
Okay. I have one more question for you about this. Now, it seems like what you were saying is that these gentlemen diplomats, these British gentlemen diplomats, were proposing a greater Israel. Essentially, that's what it sounds like, a biblical greater Israel, which obviously, some of the members of the current coalition would be very behind. But I wonder, how did the Jews see that at that point? Were they interested in this biblical notion of Israel, or was it more of a pragmatic thing at that point?
I think it was a combination of both. Certainly their vision of what they presented in 1919 was quite biblical, but there was also a lot of economic benefits to it in terms of farmland, in terms of water rights. They one of the principles that when the mandates were given to the French and the British, a mandate was basically a response to this idea that emerged out of World War I that different groups should have self-determination, including the Jews, including the Arabs. But there were groups that were not like Europeans who were kind of too infantile, let's say, in their development to be able to take a state for themselves. So they needed some sort of a mandate where Europeans would help bring them to the proper amount of culture. So the British were very determined to make sure that the Jews, who they didn't think needed to go that far to be able to run a state, had everything needed to have a coherent state, which is in the region, of course, water, a very valuable resource, and farmland. And that was something that the Zionists pushed for as well. 1920, you have the San Remo Conference. That's when the borders are agreed upon. But there's this time between 1919 and 1920 where there's this kind of no man's land. There's this war in Syria between the French and some of the local Arabs. And that actually brings in these 4 isolated Jewish settlements in the Finger of the Galilee, including Tel Chai, which was, this famous battle where Yosef Trumpeldor was killed in 1920. That was not part of the civil war that emerged within Palestine itself between the Jews and the Arabs. That was more a part of what was going on, this kind of no man's land, this undefined frontier where the French and the British had not quite set out who was in charge, and different groups were fighting for it. And there was Bedouin tribes who got into that fight with those isolated Jewish settlements.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was Tel Chai Day just last week. And I always find it really fascinating to, of course, learn about Trumpeldor's story, but also just to imagine how difficult and precarious life would have been for those early settlers in that area, so secluded.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was barely roads in the area, but oftentimes, or in most cases, there was isolated Jewish settlements, and to move between them, you had to go through areas that were either controlled by Bedouin tribes. Certainly in the Finger of the Galilee, there was plenty of tribes around Lake Hula and everything north of the Sea of Galilee. But there was also, of course, cities and other hostile groups of Arabs. But there was also Christian communities, which were natural allies, mostly to the Jewish settlement as well. And there was plenty of Arab settlements that at the time were not hostile to the Jewish settlement. But what really had the British decide to really fight for the Jewish claims to that Finger of Galilee. If you look on a map, the border's pretty straight, and then it bumps up and it goes around Metula. That was because there was this agricultural settlement of Metula, and the British wanted to make sure that every Jewish settlement was not on the French side, but was indeed on the British side. So it was less Tel Chai, it was more Metula that defined that. Now, a problem that continues to this day is that the British used a 1 to 100,000 map, which is not very great detail to draw the line. And they and the French understood that we're not really sure what it looks like on the ground. You can draw a border on a map, but you have to go on the ground and you have to actually determine this tree, this hill, this spring. So there was 2 gentlemen, Newcomb on the British side, Palais on the French side, and they, in 1921, 1922, and this was set in 1923, went along the border and they started establishing. Here's the border. And they found that the border that was roughly drawn on the map was cutting through villages and was also cutting villages off from their agricultural hinterland. So they started making corrections. Okay, so all of a sudden, this line it's definitely no longer the Sykes-Picot line. Not at all. It's not even the 1920 line. It's this other line that tries to take in the realities on the ground and tries to be pretty logical there. Now, that I think has set up some of the disagreements today. And I want to note that on the British side, so they have gotten the mandate for Palestine. They are determined to create a Jewish state and an Arab state. But there are 7 Shiite villages on the British side, right? So which is going to be part of this future Jewish state. There are 7 villages, which is also going to cause problems in the future. Now, when we think today about the relationship between Israel and Lebanon as an adversarial one, that was not the case in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was no border. You wouldn't know just looking at the ground when you crossed, right? You would walk across. Metula, the farmers in Metula had hundreds of dunams in what is today Lebanon that they were farming. They would even pay taxes to Lebanon. And people would go back and forth. The Jews would go to conduct trade in southern Lebanon, especially in the Christian villages, weddings, things like that. So it was a very open boundary, and it was a boundary, again, between British and French-controlled areas. There was no sort of military presence keeping anyone there. Our next big event, of course, is the War of Independence, right? That war where Israel actually expands the boundaries it was given by the UN and by the partition plan. And by the end of 1948, they had embarked on Operation Hiram, named after a king of Hiram, of Tyre in Lebanon. And they were actually occupying, I believe it was 20 villages in southern Lebanon. They actually had a defensive line that went up to the Litani. Right, so the ultimate agreement between Lebanon and Israel was not where Israeli troops stopped. They actually retreated back to that French-English border, and then they signed an agreement with Lebanon. Now, they signed a series of armistice agreements with Arab countries around their borders. None of those, they were explicitly said, these are not international borders. We're not recognizing Israel, but it's a separation of forces agreements. But with Lebanon, it actually said that it is an international border, interestingly, even though it wasn't later recognized as such. But in terms of Lebanon and Israel, there was no source of conflict in the 40s and 50s. I will say that those 7 Shiite villages that we mentioned earlier, cleared out by the IDF, some fled, whatever narrative you want, and I'm sure it's a mix of the two. They ended up moving into Lebanon. They were given citizenship by Lebanon. But today, one of the Hezbollah claims, what will it take for Hezbollah to stop defending Lebanon, is that those 7 villages should go back to Lebanon. Obviously not going to happen, but you see how the seeds of Hezbollah claims were set at the time. Now, in the 50s, I said there's no fight between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon is dominated by Christians. There are Christians in southern Lebanon who have wonderful relations. Again, people are still moving across the border. What really makes it a place where there is hostility and risk to Israel, it's a lot of the Palestinians who were expelled or fled because of the 1948 War of Independence. Some went to Jordan, then they tried to set up a state there, and then they were expelled from Jordan in 1970, and they started setting up what was called Fatah land, which is PLO-dominated areas in conflict with the local communities, but using that as a land to attack Israel. And that turned the northern border of Israel, the border with Israel, Lebanon, into one where there was a serious risk and infiltrations of terrorism. And that changed the whole way Israel looked at the border and the reality of that border.
Wouldn't you say, though, Laser, it was still very much a pioneering people who was settling along the northern border? Because, again, the seclusion and the slightly, precariousness of the security situation, it's not as if everything was 100% calm in all of these decades. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that in the 60s, before the PLO really started setting up shop and attacking in force across the border, that wasn't the most precarious borders. Of course, everywhere along the Green Line with Jordan, right, which is today under Israeli control, that was also precarious. The rest of the border with Jordan, the border near Syria was firing on Israeli farmers around the Sea of Galilee. So there was other more precarious ones, but that becomes with time. Once the Palestinian terrorists start attacking across the border, that becomes the scene of some spectacular and horrific attacks in the 1970s. But the 67 war I want to mention as well. The 1967 war changes Israel's boundaries, right? So in every front, we take the Sinai, we take the West Bank, Jerusalem from Jordan, we take the Golan Heights from Syria. And in every one of these, what does Israel do? Establishes, also the Gaza Strip, establishes communities, settlements. The one place where we never did that, of course, was Lebanon. We've never established a Jewish settlement there. We've never had any claims on land. But this does affect the border in one way. Even though Lebanon was not a scene of fighting in 1967, they didn't join in on the attack on Israel. But since Lebanon and Syria also have a boundary, they don't have an agreed upon border. Okay, so Lebanon has no agreed upon borders. But there's the border between Syria and Lebanon, and the boundary between Syria and Lebanon, some of it became the boundary between Israel and Lebanon. Right, so it wasn't part of this 1923 agreement. It was part of an internal French way to separate their own mandate. And that is today what we call Hardov, or the Sheba Farms, which is this area that in some maps is shown as Lebanon. Most are shown as part of Syria. Syria now says it's part of Lebanon, but through most of history has claimed it as its own. The village of Sheba is in Lebanon. These are kind of the agricultural lands of it. And it's a dispute. Again, this is another casus belli that Hezbollah has against Israel, where they say, we will give up if Israel gives back the Sheba farms to Lebanon. Israel says this is part of our something we've annexed from Syria, and if we want to have peace agreements with Syria, we can discuss it. But that is a way the border with Lebanon changed after 1967.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating. And I do wonder, however, since our time is a bit short now, how this all plays into what's happening today. Of course, we've had the maritime border, which was mediated before the war. So we're in the before the war era. But now, today, according to your reporting, Laser, last week, there are signs that Israel and Lebanon could actually reach some kind of normalization, some kind of real agreement. And I assume that's because we're now in the after the war era, meaning Hezbollah is so much less of an actor in Lebanon. So do you see it right now, Laser, as this like window of potential that we haven't had in the past several decades, that maybe right now is the time that Israel and Lebanon could normalize and create some kind of, well, number one, recognition of each other, but some kind of border?
So we have to say what happened in the last couple of decades. The border disappeared in the 80s, right? Israel invaded into Lebanon to get rid of the PLO and controlled everything from Israel north at different times to Litani, and north of that from 82 until 2000. Right, the occupation of southern Lebanon. Israel withdrew in 2000, and the UN said they signed off on this, that Israel has withdrawn from every piece of Lebanon. They did not accept the Hezbollah claims about Sheba farms. After 2000, of course, like you're alluding to, Hezbollah built up on the border. There was the 2006 war, which Israel went in again, pulled out again from everything. Again, UN signed off on this, except for this town of Rajar, which is our one Alawite village, which goes into Lebanon, but we control both sides of it. And that was the case. There was this tense, very, very hostile border until the October 7th attacks. Hezbollah got involved. Israel didn't do much in terms of ground operations until mid to late 2024. And that's when it moved in and really changed the reality in Lebanon. Hezbollah is much, much less of a threat than it was. Leaders were killed, both at the top of the organization and leaders in the field. Its rocket force is badly beaten, and it's not going to be the same for a long time than it was beforehand. The question is, how much control does it have over the country? Before the war, it basically had a veto power. Now you have this new president, as usual, a Christian, an army man, who would represent the communities in Lebanon that don't want to be at war with Israel and might even be sympathetic to Israel, generally anti-Hezbollah. So in terms of that, there is potential. At the same time, they can't go too far and risk a civil war or giving the anti-Israel, anti-Western forces an excuse to start a civil war or to attack the government. They have to really build up legitimacy and slowly build up stability. Now, if you're talking about the maritime agreement, which was started in, let's say, 2000, well, it goes back a ways, but...
Right. Even a decade earlier, the whole process began, of course, because of the natural gas fields that were discovered in the waters.
Right. So it was kind of an academic question. And then once Israel was finding and being able to exploit natural gas, Lebanon started getting interested. So you have the Karish field, which Israel claims totally in this area. And then there's another field, the Kana field, which is kind of split. And that was what Lebanon wanted to have rights to try to exploit, to try to take out. This goes back to the 1923 problem, because since they didn't properly delineate where the land border hits the sea, they said Ras al-Nakora, Rosh Hanikra, but that's an area. It's not an exact point. There's not like a tree or rock that they're pointing to. Then the different sides have different claims that help their own sides about where the sea border and what angle it should go to. Israel says 90 degrees off the coast. Hezbollah, Iran, Lebanon, when they were talking about this, certainly Hezbollah had a veto over everything. So wanted it to go at a much shallower angle and to take in hundreds of nautical miles. What happened in 2022 through U.S. mediation as that Hezbollah, Lebanon, which was under significant control by Hezbollah, was given a lot of their claim. They weren't given the full claim. They got rights to the Kana field, but they would have to pay in a certain formula through a French company to Israel. What has happened is they have not been able to find much gas there, so that has not done much for their very badly struggling economy. It did not lead to the hope for land negotiations that Israel had been talking about. But now there is an attempt at least to talk about the land negotiations. I don't think it's going to lead to normalization in the short term, but if they can start to get some sort of productive talk about where the disagreements, these 13 points along the northern border are, then maybe we can start to look forward in the future. But it will certainly take a continued weakening of Hezbollah and a strengthening of the central government. We'd want to see the French and the Saudis actually come back in, prop up the government, and give them the legitimacy to normalize with Israel. It would probably have to come after an Israeli-Saudi agreement.
What's really interesting to me, Laser, in the maritime negotiations is that Israeli governments kind of changed in between the signing of it and the implementation of it. And here we are again, where, Israel never really has a fully stable government. It depends who you ask, of course. But here we are again. Netanyahu is in power. There are a lot of challenges to his rule. And we're embarking on this potentially path of creating some kind of normalization or border. And of course, there will be a lot of people objecting just because perhaps the government in Israel is so, I wouldn't say precarious, but it's so challenged at this point. Do you think this could at all play into the diplomatic side of things? Meaning, will the negotiations move forward, even though in Israel itself, there are a lot of internal battles currently, right now?
I think that won't affect the domestic political situation, because it's not like there's a ideological battle over the northern border with Lebanon here, right? And many of the key issues with Israel, there's no ideological battle. Everyone agrees we should have peace with Lebanon. There's no right-wing, left-wing issue over specific points. If it was giving up Hardov, the Sheba farms, I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't like that, but that's not under discussion right now. And like I said, there was never any Jewish settlement by Israel in Lebanon, and no claim to annex Lebanon. So it doesn't tie into right-wing claims about resettling the land, even though it is part of the biblical Holy Land in the Jewish vision of that. So I don't think the partisan fight in Israel is going to play into this.
Okay, but let's just close out talking about the idea of a buffer zone. Right now, the IDF is still, if I'm not mistaken, in a couple points on the southern Lebanese border, the border with Israel. And do you see Israel relinquishing these points basically ever?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're there because the Lebanese army has not fully deployed properly and is in control of the area. And since Israel has learned this lesson from October 7th, it will do what it needs to make sure that there's not enemy forces right near the border, right near Israeli communities. They're there. There's 5 points that are not deep in Lebanon, but that's where they're stationed. If the Lebanese army is seen as serious and robust enough to take them, I'm sure Israel will do that. This is not anything but a security measure. You could say it's also a little bit of leverage in negotiations, but it's something that, if Israel's demands are met, certainly could be relinquished.
And you don't see any kind of political pressure on this idea of the buffer zone, because one could think that some of the more farther right elements would want Israel to remain in these 5 points at least.
Sure, they might make some noise, but I'm not sure that they are more security conscious than more left-wing parties. We certainly have some very serious security people on the left as well. I don't think this is a especially partisan issue. Again, it's not really a buffer zone, because it's not like there's a whole area of control. It's certain points that give you control over key areas, especially near Israeli communities. again, you're going to hear noise also from the communities themselves, who are by no means, all on the right. They might be very security conscious, given what they've experienced and where they live. They'll have demands as well, but ultimately, I don't think it fits neatly into the partisan divide in Israel.
Nothing ever does it, Lazer? So, Lazer, thank you so much for joining me today for the Friday Focus. And listeners, I'm reminding you again, the Friday Focus has its own channel. And please subscribe if you're interested in hearing more of these historical and contemporary looks at what's happening in our region and really across the world. So, Lazer, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to today's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about today's Friday Focus, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.